The Carolina Panthers will be wrapping up their second week of OTAs on Friday. But before we do, let's get into some of the other musings that's been going on over at Panthers OTAs right here on Locked On Panthers.
You are Locked On Panthers, your daily Carolina Panthers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, as always, Julian Council, talking Carolina Panthers with you every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Your team every day. That's our motto here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Subscribe or follow the show for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. And be sure to follow me, Julian Council, on Twitter at Julian Council, where on Fridays, like tomorrow, I'm right here on the show answering your weekly Friday mailbag questions. So either at me or DM me to get those questions in for this week's edition of the weekly Friday mailbag right here on Locked On Panthers. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. The Panthers will be wrapping up their sixth OTA practice on Friday. They have six of them out of nine, 6 out of 9, trying to get my numbers right. They'll wrap up their 6 OTA practice on tomorrow, and then have 3 more next week, and then we'll get into mandatory minicamp. So on today's show, I gave y'all my observations yesterday, but I want to bring on someone else who has been there, boots on the ground, for 2 of the open media sessions the last 2 weeks. That's Alex Zietlow, the Charlotte Observer. We had him on before the draft, having him on again today to get his thoughts on what the Panthers have been doing out there at OTAs. If there's anything he can take away from it, also the relationship between Dave Canales and Bryce Young, and how improved this roster is, as we haven't talked to him since the draft occurred. So here is Alex Zietlow of the Charlotte Observer right here on Locked On Panthers. All right, back here on Locked On Panthers. As promised, Alex Zietlow, he is one of the 2. There are 2 beat reporters for the Charlotte Observer. Mike K, you know him. We talked to Mike a lot. Haven't had Mike on the show recently, but we'll talk to Mike at some point in time. But Alex Zietlow does a great job covering your Carolina Panthers, my Carolina Panthers, our Carolina Panthers here for the Charlotte Observer. Check him out. Check Langston Wirtz out. Scott Bauer, the whole sports department over there, as they do a great job. And he is nice enough to join the show here at the end of May with so many things going on with the Carolina Panthers. Alex, what's going on, man?
And so many consequential things, Julian. For the audience, I'm being a bit facetious. But yeah, no, there's still plenty to talk about. As we were talking about off air.
And we will talk about it as OTAs are currently going on, organized team activities for the uninitiated. By the way, they are voluntary. I had someone ask me last week, are you concerned that players decided not to show up for these workouts after going 2-15? No, not really, because it's voluntary, but we'll see how it works out, because there is some talk out there that the PA wants to move this part of the offseason to closer to the start of the season, which I find odd, how they would want something that's voluntary now to then be mandatory in June and July. I don't know. I didn't play, but that's up to them. But let's get into OTAs. You've been out there the last 2 weeks for the media availability sessions. What have you seen? Like, what are you able to take away from what's going on right now that actually has substance? Because I'm always curious about what exactly there is that we can take away from these OTAs and think that's something that's going to factor into the season once games are actually played.
So the initial response is not a ton. And I know that is unsatisfactory on a lot of levels to Panthers fans, probably to you or whatever.
It's the truth, though. Tell the truth. Let's just be honest.
Well, that is the truth. And I think that is something that Dave Canales, even as a first-year head coach, he's been in the league for well over a decade, and he kind of knows how this goes. We've already seen him as a head coach kind of temper some of his answers, at least I have, when we ask about players and we say, hey, what have you seen of Jalen Coker? And you hear about him, and Jalen Coker is obviously this undrafted free agent, really sought after undrafted free agent wide receiver. And he goes on to explain his strengths, goes on to explain his measurables, how why he was such a desirable guy coming out of an FCS program. And then you look online and then you see all these headlines about how much Dave Canales loves Jalen Coker and how he's a shoo-in for, making the 53-man roster. And then, I don't, not to say that Dave like reads the clippings every day, but then the next day you ask a similar question and he's just like, yeah, well, he has to prove himself. And he has to, and the way that you get on a roster via the undrafted free agent pathway is to become a really impactful special teams player. And so like, there is a little bit of that, how you say, whiplash at this point of the year. Like 1 second you think that, oh my gosh, this guy is going to be the MVP. And then the next day you're like, okay, wait, this is a more reasonable way to kind of view his outlook on the season. I know another example of this sort of thing was Xavier Legette did not practice yesterday. And if you were on Panthers Twitter for
freak out
when Xavier didn't practice, it was a scary sight. And not to say that Twitter is like the fan base or whatever. And also not to say that they weren't right in thinking that. I mean, oh my gosh, all you hear is an injury. All you hear is a hamstring injury this early. And you're just like, oh my gosh, is our first round pick going to be, compromised in some way? But then you ask Dave about it and he was just like, oh yeah, we saw him go a little slow at the end of a drill yesterday and we decided to keep him out of practice today. That's all it was. So there's things like that. That is how I have kind of digested my first off-season program. Is one day could mean one thing, the next day could mean the next. The truth is somewhere in the middle of both those extremes.
And I think it is smart to hold out. I guess it's league it. I had a conversation with somebody. It's hard because like I went on radio on Thursday down in Greenville, South Carolina, and they're still saying Legette. I talked to I don't want to reveal the person I talked to because I did give information they also told me on the show. So I don't want to reveal like that person's name. But they told me it's Leggett and that he's such a nice guy that he won't. I'm not trying to correct you, but he's such a nice guy that he would never tell anybody how to properly say his name. So it is good that Canales did hold out Leggett, whatever you want to call him, until he like comes out and says like his name. Like I think anybody can call him whatever they want to. That's, a variation of his name. Obviously, don't call him something that's not his name. But I think it's smart to do that, knowing that this is a guy that you're going to want to depend on at some point in time. But yeah, like having a total fan meltdown on Twitter because a guy pulled a hamstring potentially in May is not necessarily what we should be doing here, folks. But I appreciate the passion, obviously. There's one thing that I find interesting, and it's that we talk about absences, and Jadeveon Clowney, like he has not been out there, correct? He was not there last week. Was he there on Wednesday when you were out there?
No, he was not there Wednesday. He was there, though, for the first initial veteran volunteer.
Yeah, so that was what the I have it written down here. He was there for the voluntary minicamp. That was April 23rd through 25th, which is great. He was there. And it's important, folks. This is voluntary. They don't have to be there. Josie Jewell wasn't there last week for the open media session, but then he was there yesterday, spoke to the media. Not a big concern there. Robert Hunt, I saw he wasn't there last week. Was he there on Wednesday? Or is he so he was there. So he missed one time. The one guy I find it interesting that who's not there is Eddie Pinheiro because he's a kicker. And wow, we don't think about kickers as being true football players oftentimes unless they make a kick. If they miss it, damn the kicker. It is interesting that he would not be out there. Have you been able to figure out what the deal is there? Because it seems like it might be a contract situation. Like he didn't kick all that well last season. So I don't really know why he would be holding out if he is holding out, but why he would be absent from OTA. It's again voluntary, but it's rare that a kicker isn't out there for this portion, especially when you do a lot of special teams stuff at this point in time. Like, what do you make of all of that?
Well, it's a difficult thing to understand. I mean, and I do understand the curiosity behind it because it's a new coaching staff. You don't have this guy and Chris Tabor, who is literally your second, third father, whatever, who is going to look out for you sort of thing. I understand that perception, but and so yeah. And of course, whenever I asked Dave yesterday in the press conference, hey, have you any update on Eddie Pinheiro? Have you talked to him? Have you had any meaningful discussions about his future. And he was just like, nope, it's the same as it was the last time we spoke. And also by the way, Harrison Mavis has done a great job for us. And so then he just goes on to that. Harrison has been doing a great job, by the way. He seems to be like a fun guy to play with, and pretty stout professional at this point. But anyway,
kicker.
Yeah, well, oh goodness, I did not mean for that pun.
That's what they call him. That's his nickname when he was at the zoo. They call him a thicker kicker.
No, yeah, totally. But that's not. When I said stout, I mostly meant like solid, consistent.
Okay,
Julian, don't do that.
Not Julian, like don't do that. Not like portly.
Okay. Well, the point is like I do not know the exact reasoning why Eddie Pinheiro is not there. It is a bit curious. I mean, you know, a lot of other people on the special teams are there. JJ Jansen, who's been there since, you know, the 60s, is there. I don't know what's going on beyond the fact. And yes, of course, when you put it behind this backdrop of, hey, he is going into his final year of his contract, the Panthers could financially benefit perhaps from cutting him before a certain date or releasing him before a certain date. There's interesting storylines there, but I mean, at this point, we just don't know. And Dave Canales isn't really telling us on the record. So that answer will come to light early June. So in a couple days.
Right. Because they have mandatory minicamp from June 11th through 13th. So in 2 weeks' time, when he's supposed to be here, we'll find out whether he shows up. Now, he'll take a fine, and kickers don't make that much. They do make a lot more than you and I and most people listening to this podcast. But I would imagine he's not trying to incur any fines. And it would have to be the first time in league history. Probably not, but it'd have to be, in my mind, the first time in league history if a kicker decides not to come to a mandatory minicamp to get fined. So we'll see how that works out. Be careful, Eddie. If Beavis is actually making these long kicks, you may be liable to lose your job. But let's talk about Bryce Young. But we'll do that here in just a moment as we take a quick pause here on the show. Alex Zietlow, Charlotte Observer, with me, Julian Council, here on Locked On Panthers. Gametime makes getting NBA Finals tickets even faster and easier. Prices on Gametime app actually go down the closer it gets to tip-off. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Gametime takes guesswork out of buying NBA tickets. And it's not always easy, obviously, to get tickets to the finals. You can go see the Boston Celtics play, whoever the hell they play. We don't know just yet who they're going to play. But when you do, you can save up to 60% off buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, etc. Get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. Take the guesswork out of buying NBA Finals tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL. That's LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Right, back here on Locked On Panthers, Julian Council, joined by Alex Zietlow of the Charlotte Observer. Go and follow him on Twitter, or if you call it X, cool. He's at Alex Zietlow 05 there on the Bird app, now the X app, whatever you want to call it. I guess it's technically a website that has an app. Either way, check him out. Follow your local paper, as he does a great job. Mike Kay does a great job. Scott Fowler, who's been there since, he talked about people being here since like the 60s. Scott Fowler, I think, may have brought the Charlotte Observer to Charlotte. So go check all the work that those guys do covering the Carolina Panthers. All right, so we're thinking OTAs, trying to figure out what exactly there is to take out of it, which not a ton. But there is one thing that everyone obviously is curious about. It's the relationship between Dave Canales and Bryce Young. And Dave has talked about how really did a lot of classroom work the first part of the offseason program. Now they're doing more on-field, getting the installs in, trying to get communication down, understanding what exactly he wants out of them. And then they'll do kind of like a final exam with mandatory minicamp in a couple weeks, then the break, and then they go back and do it all over again when training camp starts. And I'm imagining a lot of that has to be pretty intensive, like what he wants to see out of Bryce Young. What have you seen from that relationship and kind of development with Bryce working with Dave Canales up until this point in the offseason?
Well, at this point, this is really universal among all players. Good vibes are spring eternal. And I know that might sound strange for a team that went 2-15, but as Adam Thielen said earlier in this offseason, like that's kind of the vibe before every season. I mean, everyone is undefeated. Everyone is feeling healthy, unless outside of the, strange Xavier Leggett. You're going to have to remind me once more. But the
Leggett.
Okay. Well, I'll go and I'll verify it with him next. But
can you please? Because we need someone. You're a journalist. Do your job. We need you to ask the question.
Honestly, it's journalism malpractice at this point for Alex Zietlow. Like, what are you doing, man?
Yeah.
But yeah, so vibes are good vibes are spring eternal. And but specifically, one interesting thing that is kind of brewing between Dave and Bryce is they both seem to have similar temperaments, similar demeanor, similar mentalities when it comes to, hey, we're not really into the whole external negative motivation thing. And I know for people who might be listening to this, they're just like, okay, what's the point of that? I don't care about how you get motivated as long as you do. Mm-hmm. Well, like this is Bryce Young perhaps is part of a different generation of athlete nowadays where you don't need to be yelled at and cussed at to get motivated. I mean, when you ask both Bryce and Dave about, hey, y'all don't have any primetime games this year, like what's your reaction to that? They both were like, yeah, nah, we got to earn it. But at the same time, that's not how I respond to a challenge. Like I hope some people do in our locker room. I hope that does provide benefits to us. But we, as Dave says, we speak one language. We tell them what we want to see, not what we don't want to see. And I think, and there's probably some sort of marriage between them, between Carolina's two most impactful people at this point in the season. There's probably something to that. Obviously, right now, I'm just kind of theorizing, as we all are, about how that will actually manifest itself on the field. Dave has been honest about the fact that at least at the beginning, they weren't getting in and out of the huddle as quickly as he wants. There's a little bit of rust when it comes to getting the play call in, a little bit of, hey, Bryce, get the ball out faster. But at this point, when you're throwing on air, when you're throwing against defenses without pads on, without like the threat of like getting hit, there isn't a ton to be discerned, at least right now. At least that's what I think. Of course, like there probably is. And Josie Jewell yesterday actually said, yeah, you can tell actually a little bit how an offense is going to comport itself. A lot of it though happens in training camp. A lot of it is when there is pads, when people are moving at like full speed. That's when you can tell, okay, our offense has a shot, or our offense is a little bit more explosive as possible. But then again, that can be deceiving as well, because a lot of fans thought that DJ Chark was going to be like this really huge deep threat. And I do think that he was like kind of written off a little too early. I thought he actually did have a boatload of talent, but so everything at this point like can be a bit deceiving. So I think that's why I do fall back on hey, their temperaments are the same. Their purposes of how they view football is the same.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense. I hope that's satisfying.
Yeah. No.
Okay.
I love the anecdote from Josie Jewell as well. But so you're telling me Ian Thomas having a big day would be deceiving?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So don't buy into Ian Thomas finally having the light bulb go off. Good. Noted. I will do that. One thing.
I'm not necessarily saying that he won't. I'm just saying I'm just saying like.
I'm saying that.
There is game
trying to
history.
Get that message across.
Okay. There is game history that is much more revealing than anything you'll hear about, read about, see with your own eyes at this point in the offseason.
Yes, we have 6 years of empirical evidence that tells us that Ian Thomas ain't it. So I just want everybody out there that every time they see the tweets to relax. The thumb thugs. I heard that term this week, which I was like, I like that. The thumb thugs out there. Apologies if that offends anybody. Either way, I found it interesting too when Dave Canales was talking about the offseason. Someone, I think it was Darren Gann, asked about what can you get out of offensive linemen at this point in time. And he's more focused on like communication and technique. And that kind of feels like all that really you're trying to nail down, especially on the offense side of the ball when it comes like doing the installs, getting Bryce up to speed in this offense, getting him to be the leader of this offense as the quarterback, and also play his 111th, which is Dave Canales has taken every opportunity to take the pressure off of Bryce, not make this about Bryce, but he's a part of what they're trying to do on offense. So I found that curious when he's talking about it. But like speaking of the offensive line, kind of last thing I had for you here, Ike Ekwonu, he went up there. He spoke, I think, the first time that we've heard from him this offseason, and he was pretty honest. He didn't want to talk a lot about last season because who would want to talk about a bad season? But yeah, he did, which I love when they do that. But he called it a humbling experience, and he said that he was kind of riding off the coattails of his rookie year. And I appreciate that honesty. I don't know what you made of it, but it's interesting that he came out and pretty flatly said, yeah, I thought I was the man, and turns out I wasn't.
So, Julian, I was obviously following this team quite closely as someone who just lived in North Carolina, as someone who grew up watching the Carolina Panthers. But Ike's rookie season was before I got on the beat. So I do want to pose this question to you. How would you characterize Ike's rookie season, first season?
I thought it was solid considering the constant turnstiles that the Panthers had over a decade since Jordan Gross retired, and that he had that long streak of no sacks. Now he gave up one in the most important game of the season against Tampa on the road that led to a Sam Darnold fumble, but he provided hope that this was going to be the answer for like the next decade at left tackle. And last year it caused a lot of questions of whether he needed to move inside. Now, I always told fans, you guys always say move to guard, but you never offer solutions. Like it's complaining about something, but never offering a solution, which a lot of people did. And seems like the solution is keeping him out there, but we'll see what they're able to do. But that was my impressions of his rookie year. Okay.
So I think it's fair to say that given that perspective, that last year was a little bit of a setback. And it was a regression. And Ike did talk about, hey, like I'm not writing. I didn't use the resources that were available to me. I didn't talk to as many coaches as possible. We had a very veteran offensive line, and maybe I wasn't, letting Taylor Moton get in my ear as much as I should have been. So whatever the case may be, accountability is always important, but also scheme is also very important. Scheme, like what was he doing? What is Ike Ekwonu's strengths when you just boil it down? Dude can maul. Dude is, even as someone who's going to a third year in the NFL, he is oftentimes going to be the biggest dude on the field whenever he's there. He's probably going to be the strongest dude when he's on the field. The offense last year was not Ike's game. I mean, it wasn't suited absolutely to Ike's game. And
yeah, I mean, it's pass first. You're in a shotgun the whole time. Like it's very obvious what you want to do. And when when the defense can pin their ears back, and you're always trying to pass protect, and you're playing with a different guy at left tackle every week, you're probably going to struggle.
Yes, and I mean it's as simple as that in a variety of ways. And then Dave Canales comes in. I've talked a lot about his his charisma, his youthful energy, his ability to connect with Bryce Young. Well, he's known as someone who can adjust to people's strengths. He's known as figuring out his personnel grouping, whatever that may be. Even when he was a lower level assistant at Seattle, when he was the offensive coordinator at Tampa Bay, he takes his guy's strengths and says, okay, let's simplify it as much as possible and say, okay, what do we feel comfortable with? Do we feel comfortable running the ball to the left side? Do we feel is there a play where Bryce Young can drop back, plant his foot in the ground, and just throw it without really thinking about it? I think that is very important. And then another positive is Dave is going to run the ball. He's going to be stubborn about, hey, I'm going to call a lot of run plays. Ike, now's your time. And so I think all of these things, and again, every time I come on your show, I tend to like spew optimism, and I really like am trying not to just like be that guy. But I think that considering his kind of setbacks last year, and considering like the offensive philosophies that we have heard espoused and have seen empirically from any Dave Canales system, I think Ike should have like a good bounce back year. But again, that requires him to stay healthy, which he has been able to. That requires his offensive line around him to stay healthy, which they haven't been able to throughout this year. So, I mean, there's still a lot of things to be said. The accountability thing is cool though. And I think that isn't not insignificant. In other words, that is significant.
Yeah, no, I agree. Cause like shows leadership, and he's a guy who's entering into that kind of part of his like career where in this rebuild, which I believe this still is a rebuild, he's going to have to be a leader on that offense. And he's somebody that you want to build around. And for him to go out there and to be honest and say that, I appreciate it. And this is the thing I keep going back to when there's a lot of criticism about him last year, which is certainly fair. But you also look at all the issues about like the offense, the predictability of it, the injuries that are next to him, and not having that continuity. And that's such a big part of playing offensive line. And Dave Canales talked about communication and technique. Like that's what they're working on. His technique, he talked about too, that he kept doing some of the wrong things and he didn't ever fix it. Now he's really working to fix it this year by talking and using his resources. The thing I keep going back to is Thomas Brown admitted that he could have done more to help him out, and he didn't. Like the coaches also have to do their jobs to put the players in the right position. And it sounds like that should be the case. Now, like, he's got to go out there and do it. But just going back to just how poorly coached his team was, and for a coach to openly admit after the disastrous season that, yeah, I kind of got that one wrong, it doesn't completely absolve Icky of blame, but it certainly sheds a light on maybe it wasn't all him last year after all. But yeah, I appreciate your insight, man. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, Julian, I do have one thing that you kind of spawned in my brain. So you know the old adage of the person that you hire after the person you fire is going to be completely opposite from the person you fired?
Yeah.
Okay, so you get Matt Rule, this charismatic dude who, before the record was involved, Carolina loved him. Or at least what?
He's a vibes guy.
I was like, initial press conferences, of course, Dave Tepper rolls out the red carpet for him. He like said, "Hey, this is my guy," and everyone who had any sort of emotions was like, "Yep, that's him." And people in Nebraska are actually feeling that way right now. Funny side story, but anyway, and so Matt Rule era doesn't work out. What do? You hire someone who is the anti-Rule in a lot of cases, and you get someone who isn't as fired up, who isn't as going to sell you on words. But hey, he's proven. He is known to work with quarterbacks like Phillip Rivers, work with quarterbacks like Andrew Luck. Okay, this is the Frank Reich era. And now, but one interesting thing about that was, okay, not only am I going to hire the opposite of Matt Rule brought in all of his college buddies to help him out and come in and say, hey, we're going to bring the college game to the NFL. Frank's like, I'm going to bring in the most established, the most promising NFL coaches across the league, and we're going to bring them to Carolina. And even if I haven't worked with them before, we're going to make it work here. And then, so where does Dave fall into all this? Is he closer to Rule? Is he closer to Reich? The thing that separates Dave from Frank, but also from Matt, is Dave comes in and he brings in all of his own NFL guys. They're speaking one language, and it's clear that they're speaking one language. I could not imagine a Thomas Brown situation happening this year, because everyone is one. It just seems like they're moving in such in a way that is like everything that Dave wants is what the coaches are going to carry out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's extremely telling with all the defensive injuries the Panthers had. And like, this wasn't a good defense. They had their moments, but just look at the numbers. They weren't a good defense. But it's very telling that with all the injuries that they had, they still were able to be competent and not have infighting, and everyone on that staff is back. But you look at offense, they did not have nearly as many injuries. At no point were they competent, and at no point were they ever on the same page. That was very telling about last season to me.
Yeah. And I mean, so when you look at the history of the last three coaching staffs, they are distinctly different, all three of them. Even if you want to make comparisons to Rule and Canales, even if you want to, whatever you want to do, they are distinctly different. And I think this is probably the place where you should be if you're the Panthers. Take a chance on a guy who is charismatic, but also has and does give off youthful energy, but also does have this robust NFL experience, has coached under the best coaches in the NFL and Pete Carroll and what have you. And with that, I'm done with being on here and just spouting Panthers positivity because I know that gets me in trouble. So, Julian, take us away.
Yeah, no, but like, hey, I kind of agree with you. Like, you look at the last two
Yeah.
coaches that no one here in Carolina is ever going to feel fondly of. Like, Canales, in a way, like on paper, has like all the best parts of them.
Yeah.
As much as people may hate Rule now, like they fed into it, they love them. Like, I call him a vibes guy. He's not necessarily an offensive or defensive coach. It's all vibes, baby. And like Dave Canales kind of brings those vibes. And then like that's kind of similar. And also kind of bringing guys that you know. Now, he has guys that have NFL experience, unlike Matt Rule, who didn't bring in guys who had NFL experience on his staff, which was obviously a problem. But then you look at Frank. Frank had the pedigree of having worked with quarterbacks. Dave Canales, what he did with Baker Mayfield and with Geno Smith last year. It's like all the good things that you like kind of that you liked about the coaches on paper when they came here. Like Canales has that, but like more of it. And hopefully it works out. But we'll see. But I don't think you're being overly positive. I think you certainly are bringing up some astute points, and you're going to make some people think. So I do appreciate you for coming on the show. Alex Zietlow, again, check him out, Charlotte Observer, on Twitter at Alex Zietlow05, or I guess it's also X, whatever the hell you want to call it. And subscribe to your paper, folks. It's like $1, and then it's not, but it's $1 for like a long time. So go do it. So please support local. No one else is covering the Panthers. No one's writing about your team. If they're writing about your team, usually not positive things and not informative things. But the Observer, they're doing it. So go do that. Go check out the paper. Alex, appreciate you, brother.
Thank you, Julian.
All right, we'll take a quick pause and come back and wrap up the show here on Locked On Panthers. All right. Always great catching up with Alex Zietlow of the Charlotte Observer. Get his perspective on what's going on at OTAs. Not that much. And we kind of talked about this after he left. Like, really, for me, and obviously these are important times in the offseason for the players to get up to speed with what's going on with their scheme, especially the offensive side of the ball. That's a brand new scheme, brand new players, trying to get that continuity, the communication, the technique down. Obviously, very important work that's being done. But as far as like you, the fan who is interested in it, they feed you with the clips. I feed you with the interviews and the content and my opinions of the kind of things that are said, trying to dissect what this may mean, what it may not mean, whether it is important or not. It's one of those things where we're going to really wait until like training camp. And when we talk about training camp, when they start having joint practices, when they start to see other teams, when we get to preseason, that's where like the position battles really begin. That's where guys can separate. And that's where you can really get to know who this team is going to be. Right now, it's good to hear that the communication is good, that the intensity is up, and hopefully that translates to when they finally do have training camp like right there where they're already at here on Cedar Street in Uptown Charlotte. But I don't think you should get too consumed. Like the Leggett thing, league it. Got to get you saying that. That is obviously like concerning in a way, but he does have a lot of time before it truly becomes that big of a concern. You don't like that a guy who just drafted is starting to do these workouts. He's kind of feeling some tightness, but he's got plenty of time to recover, to get his body right, and really get mentally prepared for what will be, an intensive, grueling training camp. And that's part of what they're doing right now is getting those guys prepared for what they're expected to be like, the expectations for like the offense and what their role may be. And then we get to when it really starts to matter in August, not even at the end of July, like in August, once we really get to the meat and potatoes of it all with training camp and the preseason. That's going to wrap up this edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, hosted by yours truly, Julian Council. Again, y'all subscribe or follow the show for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. And be sure to follow me, Julian Council, on Twitter at Julian Council, where tomorrow on Friday, I'll be answering your weekly Friday mailbag questions. So either at me or DM me to get those questions into me right now. So do that. But as I always say, be happy, be whole. What did I say? And always keep pounding. Be safe, be happy, be whole. And as always, keep pounding. I'll talk to you on Friday. I almost forgot what I typically say.